Hello, and welcome back. I put on my very best history shirt today because I wanted to come on here and talk about my favorite books that I read to get my undergrad in history. So I want to tell you about my top 10, sneak peek right here. But don't think that these are just going to be boring. History doesn't have to be boring. A lot of the books on here aren't even nonfiction. There's a lot of fiction, there's a lot of journalism. This is a wide range of books that is not boring at all. So whether you're looking to get into history, a lot of these have a very low barrier to entry, and they are interesting even if you're a casual history enjoyer. And if you already do like history and are into it, a lot of these titles you might not have heard of before, because I don't think I would have heard of them unless I had this wonderful professor that I have. In the bookshelf tour that I posted last weekend, whenever I showed you my history shelf, I asked if you guys would care to watch a video about the books that I got during my undergrad, and 1 or 2 comments said yes. So thanks to those 1 or 2 comments, because I was going to post it anyway, but now I feel like somebody cares. So long story short, let's get started. These books were awesome, and there's a little something in here for everybody. Sitting at number 10 is Billiards at 9:30 by Heinrich Böll. This is a work of fiction, and this is from a German history class that I took a couple years ago. And this class was very, very good. So a couple other books on this list are also from that class. Long story short, German. So this book is about a man named Robert, and at the beginning of World War II, he is very anti-war. He wants nothing to do with it. But after fleeing from the Nazis, he ends up fighting for the Nazi forces. I think he's even a commander whenever they are retreating. And in the war, he ends up destroying his father's... none of this is a spoiler, by the way. This is in the synopsis. But he ends up destroying his father's building that was like the pride of the father's career. And so after the war, Robert is a bit disheartened, and so he fights against his emotions by leading a highly structured life. So at 9:30 every single morning, he goes and he plays billiards. And all of this gets torn down whenever a former schoolmate and a former man who was with him during the Nazi regime comes to play billiards with him. All of this comes crumbling down, and he begins to think about his life in the war and how this impacted him. What is so wonderful about this is it really tackles the generational trauma between the 2 world wars, during the 2 world wars, and just familial issues that would occur during this time in Germany. This book is unbelievably wonderful. I think that it would be higher up on the list had I read it a little bit more, because, you know, I skimmed it just a little bit. Like, I mostly read it, but I think if I read it cover to cover, hardcore, I would love this book. So I plan on rereading it whenever I'm in the mood for it. But as it stands now, this book was very good, even if I didn't read every single page. I read most of it. So this book is very good. Highly recommend if you're looking in for World War II fiction that isn't necessarily strictly war-based. Sitting at number 9, you cannot have a list of books about history without talking about Livy, one of the earliest historians. The early history of Rome and his history of Rome, I'm just combining this into one book. Livy was a historian during ancient Roman times. So he was writing kind of at the turn from BCE to CE. So he was writing histories before we even kind of see history starting in the current era. So he really blends myth and history and moral philosophy kind of together to present how Romans saw themselves. And so this was more of like an ideological project to kind of show Rome's moral and political identity during Augustus's reign. So Livy starts with myth, and not necessarily because he fully believes that it is true, because he sees importance in it. He believes that it's really integral to the Roman identity. So he talks about Romulus and Remus, the Sabine women, I think they were called. I kind of forget, it's been a while. But he really does admit that a lot of the early information in this, the more myth stories in here, are unverifiable. And he admits that, so, you know, he's kind of saying take this with a grain of salt. But this is a very important historical fact. He sees value in the lessons, even if he doesn't fully believe that these stories are true. So for Livy, history was more about a moral identity than factual history. So it is kind of a show of what Romans saw historiography as. So this is a very interesting book, just kind of in the way that you have to take it with a grain of salt, because even the one writing about it in ancient times couldn't verify it. So obviously we can in no way know if this information in here is true or not. But he's writing under Augustus's reign, so even if he doesn't outwardly support Augustus, he is writing in a way that aligns with the moral and political values of Augustus's reign. Because obviously if Livy went against that at all, it wouldn't be good. So, Roman history, great place to start. Sitting in a tentative number 8 is Oceans of Grain by Scott Reynolds Nelson. This book, I have some qualms with, but my reading experience of it was really enjoyable, and I do think it gave me a different lens to look at the world that I thought was interesting. So the concept of this work is that every single thing that has ever happened in the history of the world, starting from when man first came about until now, everything that has happened is solely because of grain. That's a bit of an outlandish take, and I do think that in certain points the author was making reaches to compare that and to put that together, but for the most part, this was a really cool way to look at history. So I think that a very short passage that kind of sums up what we were getting at here is that the world's pivot points are not made by proclamations or even battles. Rather, they stand on the foundations that underlie the roads leading to and from every empire in the world. They mark out where the people's food is and how long it takes to get to it, get it to soldiers and citizens. Unless this basic logistical problem is solved, an empire will starve, and starving empires can be toppled or revolutionized. So, basically, societies that are starving are easily controlled, and trade and creating a globalized planet between nations and civilizations, trade is integral to that, and grain is on the market at every point in this trade. You can see kind of where this could be a reach, that everything that has ever happened is because of grain, but it did really open my eyes to how integral something so simple can create such a vast change in the ability of a society to stay afloat. But another qualm that I have with this book, and the more I'm talking about this, the more it's kind of seeming like this book is bad. I promise this book is very good. But another qualm that I had with this book is about halfway through the book, the plot totally changes. Like at the second half of the book, we're talking about a Russian revolutionary that I had never heard of before. Nobody in the rest of my class had ever heard of before, and I don't even really know if my professor knew who this person was. Parvis. So the last half of the book was just talking about a random revolutionary that kind of connected to grain, but it kind of felt like Nelson just found a figure that he really wanted to talk about and just talked about him for the second half of the book. I don't know. I'm not selling this one really well, but I promise this is a very interesting way to look at things, and if you can take things with a grain of salt, or with a grain of salt, if you can take things with a grain of salt, that is a really interesting perspective to look into. Sitting at number 7 is Nietzsche. Now this is a collection of his works, so I'm not talking about any work in particular, though some standouts maybe were Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, The Geniality of Morals. Those are all good ones. But Nietzsche is definitely a big name in philosophical works, and I find that kind of funny because a lot of his thought claims that reasoning is not a way to enlightenment or freedom, but reasoning instead is a way of self-deception or demoralization. All you do is reason and think if you're a philosopher, but whatever. Nietzsche's work is often kind of simplified or misunderstood, which I can understand because did I always agree with Nietzsche? No. Did I always understand what he was saying? Also not really. But for the most part, this is a really compelling way to think about things because I never would have come up with a lot of the ideas that he has in here. So I guess my main point is the thing about Nietzsche is he does surprise you sometimes, but he also thinks about morals a lot. He thinks a lot about morals. And he does kind of think on the idea that morals aren't something that you were either born with or that maybe your family put into you, but morals directly come from historical power dynamics. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. Nietzsche comes up with a lot of interesting ideas. If you were to start out with Nietzsche, I think that you should start out with Thus Spoke Zarathustra, because I think that, in my opinion, that was the one that I thought was most valuable to me, and it is a really good thinker about, morals of the Superman or the Overman or whatever that translates to. It is a really interesting study. So Nietzsche is a cool one to look at, though I don't always agree with him, because he's got some interesting things to say, but Nietzsche's an important one. Sitting at number 6 is The Concept of the Political by Carl Schmitt. Now, this one, take this as you will, Carl Schmitt did end up being a prominent member of the Nazi Party. Okay? That was later after this book was written. But he later resigned from the Nazi Party because he was accused of opportunism and an insincere anti-Semitic take. So, take that as you will, but this book doesn't present Nazi ideals in any way. This book discusses what the basis of politics is, what necessitates politics, and how politics can perpetuate throughout society. Basically, the main idea here is that what politics stands on is a distinction between the friend and the enemy. Between the friend and the enemy, there is where politics is born. So without the possibility of war, politics cannot exist because there isn't a friend, there isn't an enemy to potentially fight against. So you need the potential of war to happen someday, maybe if ever. You need that possibility to have reason for politics. So this was written at a really interesting point in time because it was written in between the First and the Second World Wars, and I think that the point in time in which it was written really necessitates why this was written and why he was thinking the way that he was, because he kind of discusses how the League of Nations cannot really happen because, again, there must be this friend-enemy distinction for politics to exist, and the League of Nations is inherently political, so politics must exist. So it all cycles kind of back around, but he kind of shows how you can't take power away from others to create one entity without that one entity taking the power for itself. So this is a pretty basic look at what politics is for, what allows politics to continue throughout human society, and how there cannot be one state because there cannot be politics if there's only one state, because you must have an enemy. So this is basically just just political philosophy from a man you must think about the background of before you read it. But even if this was written by a controversial individual, I think it's important to read works from controversial individuals because you need to read the source material of what, bad people were thinking, and kind of the source material on what gave bad people ideas. Even though this doesn't say anything against or for anybody. This is just basic what is politics. So take this as you will, but I did think that this was incredibly interesting. Sitting at number 4 is Coming of Age in Mississippi, which is an autobiography by Anne Moody, who ended up being a fairly prominent member of the civil rights movement in America in the 60s. I only had to read the first half of this, which discusses her childhood, so I cannot attest to the second half, but the first half was incredibly good, so I cannot imagine the second half not being equally as good. But what was so wonderful about this is how unbelievably readable it was. The majority of the part that I read through in the first half, it's told kind of in a childlike voice because it was during her childhood. And it just kind of shows the conditioned behavior of, society and the different individuals of different races. And, it talks about living conditions and working conditions and how she was treated by different people, whether good or whether bad. And it was just so easy to read, and it felt so human, and it flowed by so quick. But through this book, you can kind of get an understanding of what it was like to live in the South during this time. And you can kind of see public opinion or public response to Emmett Till's murder, and kind of how she grew to understand how she was treated and how she entered the world. And as she aged, she could kind of grow a larger understanding of what was going on around her. Because at first she didn't notice that she was any different. And then as time went on, she kind of had experiences with various people that conditioned her into a way of thinking and a way of understanding. And she could see how other people understood the society in which they resided. Very good book. I'm kind of thinking about reading the second half later this year, if I feel like it, if I want to. But at least I can attest to the first half. This book is very good, and the reading experience of it is enjoyable, and it just really flows. This is a greatly written book. Sitting at number 3, we have Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, A Report on the Banality of Evil. And this is kind of just following the court proceedings of this man, Eichmann. And he was a perpetuator of the Holocaust. And so after the war, whenever all of the Nazis were being rounded up, he fled Germany. And he went to, I think it was Africa. But he wasn't doing a very good job of hiding, as you would expect someone would obviously think to do, would be hide. But instead of hiding, he went around boasting about the things that he did and the acts that he committed. And so obviously they found him. And so these are his court proceedings following the stupidity of his flee. And so it kind of, what this book does really powerfully is Hannah Arendt, as a Jewish reporter, she kind of takes this view on how incredibly evil acts of violence or destruction or hate don't have to be taken on by a supervillain. They can happen from just some unintelligent, banal person. It just takes being in power or being in the right place at the right time, or evil is not always carried out by some sort of supervillain. She says in here that despite all the efforts of the prosecution, everybody could see that this man was not a monster, but it was difficult indeed not to suspect that he was a clown. So this guy is presenting himself through these court proceedings as just kind of a bumbling fool. And so the processes of his mind and the things that he says are hard to believe that this man could, cause the deaths of so many people, because he doesn't seem, even smart enough to carry out these acts. And what I thought was incredibly interesting is that, of course, he did not expect the Jews to share the general enthusiasm over their destruction, but he did expect more than compliance. He expected, and received to a truly extraordinary degree, the cooperation. And so, he says that the most potent factor in the soothing of his own conscience was the simple fact that he could see no one at all that was actually against the final solution. So, in his own mind, he was doing a thing that everybody was in support of, even, the Jewish people themselves. He thought that they were in support of their absolute destruction and demise. So the way he saw it is that he was just following what society wanted, and that, this is just the way that things were. And so based on the Führer's order, whatever he did, he was just being a law-abiding citizen. And, what he was doing was his duty. So he not only obeyed orders, but he took it upon himself to obey the law. So long story short, this is an incredibly, incredibly interesting study on a man that is a clown that really enacted some tragedies. This is so very interesting. I feel like I'm due for a reread on this one. Sitting at number 3 is Philip Caputo's A Rumor of War. This is a memoir about one boy's experience, or I suppose one man's experience, going into the Vietnam War. And the main theme of this one is that all of these boys going into the war felt as if they were about to have this heroic, valiant experience that would not cause them any pain at all. They were going to go in, they were going to light the world on fire, and then they were going to go home with the reputation given to them from their families that they were heroic, and it was going to be super easy. And soon they realized the terror of war, especially a war like Vietnam, where the lines of war are blurred, the lines of the surrounding landscape are blurred, the lines of even who the enemy was and who a soldier was and who a civilian was, those lines were blurred. This is an incredibly interesting look at what people view war as whenever they're going into it, because even throughout his terrible experiences, Caputo still kind of felt like he was this hero figure. And by the end, Caputo kind of realizes that, none of them are heroes in the way that they thought they were going to be. They would not return to cheering crowds, parades, and the pealing of great cathedral bells. We had done nothing more than endure. We had survived, and that was our only victory. So, it kind of speaks to, don't think war is, it takes away that film on war that you think it's going to be a valiant experience, and then, you realize it's not. So by the end, he does have more of an anti-war ideal. But through it, you can get into his head at this rising fury that he soon feels within his heart, and he can never fully get rid of. So it goes from him entering the war through his court-martialing near the end, and then a little bit of his after-war activities. But this is, again, a super readable book. So I highly recommend this to anybody who is interested in war, because I feel like this is a wonderful work, non-fiction work, on the feelings of Vietnam. This is one. Sitting at number 2 is Stefan Zweig's The World of Yesterday. this was my introduction to Stefan Zweig. I have seen a growing rise of people reading his fiction, and I very much want to read his fiction, because if you can make an autobiography this interesting and this compelling, then I can't even imagine what his fiction works are like. But Stefan Zweig was a Jewish writer, and the way that we used this in class was we kind of used it to view public sentiment and public, just kind of societal functions before and leading up to the two world wars. So kind of, Stefan Zweig was alive during a really tumultuous time in German society. And as a Jewish person, it was interesting to see his thoughts on that, and also it wasn't discussed as much as you would think it would be during a time like this. So some of the most interesting parts of this is he started it off by, talking about this world of security that everybody thought and felt that they lived within, and kind of everything was good and everything was happy, and that's how everybody felt. But as it goes on, you can kind of see the cooling and the heating up of forces that people are turning a blind eye to, that are kind of leading up to the wars. And it kind of talks about how, suppression of young people, both in their individuality and their expression of themselves and what they do and how they act, leads to acting out. Since he was a young intellectual, this is a really compelling thing to think about, was that he was acting out by reading and writing and expressing himself. That was an act of rebellion that was looked down upon. But it also, as the world wars got closer, it kind of showed how Austria and Germany felt as if it was incredibly strong, but it didn't think about that every other country feels exactly the same way about itself. And so just the progression of societal thought is a really interesting thread throughout this book. This autobiography is so very good, and again, I feel like I'm due for a reread of this one too. And my absolute favorite book that I read during my undergrad, I don't even have a real copy of. It's in some stupid spiral book. But my absolute favorite book that I read during my undergrad was The Imperial Adventure by Larry Schweikart. I don't know if this is in print anymore, and I think that that's the reason that I have a spiral version of it. But this is the history of America told through acts of entrepreneurial spirit. So, it goes through turnpikes and how that changed America. It goes through Gillette facial razors and how that changed America, or Sears, Roebuck, or the growth of department stores, or it even talks about the Federal Reserve, which obviously is much bigger than men's facial razors. But the way that this is told, it's like, it makes the history of America so individual that, each person who came up with an invention, whether big like the Federal Reserve or small like a facial razor, it makes such an individual experience, and how individuals have the power to create America. So the feeling of being an American is creating something great. And this is told in such a compelling way, and this was for a business history class, which I cannot believe how interesting that class ended up being. But the way that market value plays such a role in the creation of a nation and the creation of what the common person experience is, this is so compelling. I recommend this to anybody who has any interest in any history at all, because this is such a fun read. It's just a series of risks and wins and, the creation of an American culture that, really leans on the individual creating something wonderful. I loved this book so much, and I wish I owned a real copy of it. But long story short, those are the 10 books that I enjoyed most whenever I was getting my undergraduate degree in history. So long story short, you should pursue a degree that really speaks to you and really makes your wheels spin and your brain move and your heart swell. You do need to have a plan though, because an undergraduate in history will not get you very far. So you need to have a plan with it, which I do. I'm gonna be a high school history teacher, but I love history. And if you enjoyed any of these books, or if you have any recommendations of books that are similar or books that you think I might like, please comment them down below. But I thank you for sticking through until the end, and I will probably post another video next weekend. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next weekend. Thank you.